Okay, so today I'm going to be planting up the chicken run with a permaculture experiment. I've got leftover saved seeds from last year's garden and a few seeds that I never planted, like this succotash that I was going to try on the grain patch, but just didn't wind up doing it. So I'm going to go through and list out everything that I'm going to plant so that I can see and compare what comes up versus what I planted, because I'll never remember. Okay, so I've got extra Fairy Morse oregano, I've got Ed Hume Russian red kale, I've got Baker Creek golden amaranth, or golden giant amaranth, I've got wholeless oats, and wholeless speaks to the casing on the actual little oat, and there's a nice picture on the front where it shows that the casing is loose or opened, so you don't really have to crush anything to get the actual oat itself out, and that can be really important depending on what kind of livestock you have and what kind of processing equipment you have. But since I don't really have any like big livestock, I just have birds that will essentially compost anything if it's natural and if it's a grain that isn't toxic to them. So for something like a grain, it doesn't really matter if it's hulled or not, or if it's bearded or not. Beards are like spears on the end of the grain itself. Here, let me grab an example. I tried to pluck the top off, but I got the whole thing. This is my rye, and these little spikes are beards. So if you stroke it this way, then it's smooth, and if you try to stroke it the other way, it's like sandpaper. It catches. So when animals try to eat it, it'll get stuck in their throats because it'll go down every which way. And this is not hullless. This has a hull. It's a little closed package where the grain actually is stored on the inside instead of being an open package where the hull is easily or the grain is easily accessible. There's a little grain. I just took it out of its little package. But that's the difference. There's hulled and hullless and bearded and beardless. And then this massive plant. It's like 5 feet long. That's from the winter rye that I've got in the back in the grain patch. Okay, so those are my packets that I'll be planting out because I don't have any use for them in my main garden. I've got saved delicata seeds from last year. Delicata is just a all-round fantastic squash. It's basically replaced the functionality of pumpkins for me till the end of time, because it's like a pumpkin and butternut squash. It's like the way you want a pumpkin to taste, but pumpkins don't actually taste that way. They're a little bit more bitter and a little bit more bland. You really have to overspice and oversweeten pumpkin to get it to be the pumpkin pie flavor. Delicata squash needs like maybe a 1/4 cup of maple syrup and then just a little bit of pumpkin pie spices, and it tastes the way you want a pumpkin pie or think a pumpkin pie should taste. And it's not a pumpkin at all. It's this oblong squash, and it's like when it ripens, it turns kind of orangey and has some stripes going through it long ways. And you can pick it unripened where it's a little bit more yellow and with green stripes, and then it all kind of oranges in the house. And I have delicata squash that has been saved for almost a year and it's doing just fine. I mean, some rot, but I could just toss those to my birds. But the ones that do keep, I mean, they sat on my counter for a year and I did nothing, so that was pretty nice. Same with the Sugar Ready. We saved some seeds from the Sugar Ready squash we grew last year. Sugar Ready was a variety of squash that my husband picked out, and it's supposed to be sort of a hybrid between like a butternut and a spaghetti squash, or like a sugar pumpkin and a spaghetti squash, and it did have the pull apart strands like a spaghetti squash, and it tasted just a little bit like a sweet spaghetti squash. It was just a little smaller. And it did have that thick rind that you had to chop through just like a spaghetti squash. The delicata has a really thin rind, kind of like an apple, or like a little bit thicker than an apple, maybe like an orange, but it doesn't peel off like an orange. It's just not one of those meat cleaver squashes. You can actually cut through it with a regular knife, which is incredibly handy. Pardon me. The Sugar Ready does have that thicker typical squash rind, but again, it was a successful grower. We just didn't grow a whole lot of them because I didn't figure out how to plant them. This year I've got all my squash and melons planted straight up into the manure, and they're doing amazing. Let's see, I've got saved seeds from Rainbow Chard, and these guys are really great because I can just set them and forget them. They will grow pretty prolifically on their own, and then they'll reseed. I've got beets. And this is all different kinds of beets. But to get that vertical planting method where you have something growing up and something growing down, plus the greens will grow up as well, I've got these beets. More Russian red kale, saved from last year, and this stuff just reseeds like crazy. We have it all over the yard. I don't even know how. I've got, here's another vertical into the ground component. This is our radish, saved from last year, and they all went to seed. So there's, let's see, can't tell what's dirt and what's radish. Oh yeah, there we go. So there is a significant amount of dirt in this bag, but you can see the little radish seeds. They're almost like tiny little acorns in there. And they're inside the pods, but I've noticed that if you just take the pod itself, and this is from my accidental microgreen failure experiment that I've learned a lot from, they produce pods like this, and usually people crack open the pod and they extract the seeds, and it takes forever. There we go. So I cracked open the pod, dug around for a second, and I found one seed. And then they do that with all of these. I have found that they will grow through this husk. If you just plant the husk, this husk breaks down like tissue paper once it gets wet, and it's almost like foam on the inside. It's got this like fuzzy insulation in there. And if you just bury these very shallowly, or even place these just on the ground and make sure that they're watered, I find that it grows just fine, and I don't need to do any work. I can just harvest the pods and plant the pods the next year. So really glad I accidentally discovered that. That was super handy. I haven't tried that technique with these, but it might work the same way. These are Lincoln Homesteader peas. I've got just a box of them here, but usually I shell these, and it's just really easy. You pop it. You just put pressure on this seam and it pops right open. And then you've got, whoops, you've got these large peas, and you just shove them in the ground willy-nilly, and those do come up. This year I have not had a whole lot of luck with Homesteader peas, and I think I planted them too late. And I think on top of that, they needed more protection from birds or competition or richer soil. But I planted these by a trellis, thinking that they, even though they're a bush variety, since I've got those little vining guys, I was hoping they would grasp on and use the trellis for support, but they barely got 6 inches high, started producing, and then they just got wiped out by something, either bunnies or birds. And last year when I planted them close to February or March, and they grew in a massive block, and they were extremely successful, and they were one of the only things growing and in a different location on my property. So there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different changes, but I'll have to change something this year. But I'll throw them into the run to grow, because I have a feeling they'll grow well in the shade when not a whole lot else will thrive in the shade. Mustard greens. So these I think are the same general case. So they've got a very thin pod, and you can see the pod and the seed here pretty clearly. And there's a lot of seeds for just a handful of pods. And this is just from kind of taking my hands along the plants and going zoop, and grabbing a handful of pods and stuffing them in the bag. And then I just crunched up the bag and shook it like this, and most of the seeds, because of the weight of them, fell to the bottom of the bag. And I took out a significant portion of the shells of the casings and just left this to save over winter. But these are another really prolific self-seeder. So once they're in and then they flower and they go to seed, they'll spread all over the place, which I really like. And a benefit for us for mustard greens is that once things get hot in the summer here, a lot of kales and leafy greens will get bitter, and kind of like the skin type texture, which I'm not a total fan of. But mustard greens will stay the texture of a lettuce, and they'll just get a little bit more mustardier, like a little bit spicier. The bitterness of the heat, what it does to plants in the summertime, in that heat, kind of benefits the flavor that's already there for the mustard greens. So I love keeping that throughout the year. I can plant it really early because it's not frost hardy, but it's cold hardy. So I can really start it from like late February, early March, all the way through October, or sometimes November, just depending on how heavy my frosts are at any given time. So another good one for the permaculture experiment. And then this one I'm not so sure of. This is our sunflowers. We kind of saved seeds from sunflowers, and we saved them kind of wet, and I let them dry out, and then when I put them in a Tupperware, I put rice in the bottom to try to draw out more of the moisture, because I knew that I would be able to tell the difference between a sunflower seed and rice. And they did get bone dry, but I'm not sure if these seeds are viable. I tried planting and starting some in the greenhouse, but I did start them poorly, and I didn't water them correctly, and I started them in weird soil, and I let them dry out a ton. So I'm hoping that if I just keep them moist and in the right environment, that they'll actually grow. And I'm gonna start an actual dedicated tray of these sunflowers and see if I can grow them if I actually pay attention to them in the greenhouse as well. So some for the birds, planted, turned into sunflowers, and then some for myself. Because my grand plan with these is to try to make sunflower oil, because that's one of the easiest oils that I can actually grow and harvest myself with a blender and a cheesecloth, as opposed to like olive oil or palm oil or coconut oil or canola oil. I can take a sunflower, like the actual insides of the sunflower, and I can blend it up or crush it and squeeze out a significant amount of oil per sunflower head, or at least that's the theory. And I don't use too much oil, I use more butter than oil, but if I'm gonna be making dedicated homestead meals, like found farm fresh or foraged, I'm gonna need some kind of farm oil in order to make some of that and to infuse some of those flavors. And then I've got this bag of succotash that's been hanging around. So this was always meant for the chickens, and this is succotash grain feed. I think there's like barley, wheat, and rye mix, in here from Territorial Seed Company, and it's meant to be a crop that you spread out over the field and either let dry out and then harvest, like with an actual harvester where it cracks all the seeds and then, or it cracks all the husks and then compiles the seeds, and then you feed those seeds and grains to your animals, or as a cover crop where you throw this out into the field, it draws up nutrients from deep down in the soil, and then you till everything into that top 6 inches so that all those nutrients then become concentrated right there at the surface. Or it's grown and then you let your animals graze on it, either when it's green or when it's dried, or you just let the animals process. And there's a few different ways it's used, just because there's a few different ways to use grains depending on what kind of animal you have or what your goals are. But my goal is to use a significant portion of this in the chicken run and see if any of these grains will grow between now and the fall when everything starts dying. Basically, I want to see how much of all of this I can grow and get established in a shady spot of our off to the side chicken run, so that once everything dies, once all the greens are out, once we stop mowing the lawn and throwing the clippings into the run, I can open up that half that I grew everything in and just let them forage for as long as possible, hopefully into the winter. I'm not sure how fast they'll process it. I'm not sure if they'll eat every single seed and I won't have any reseeded the next year. The dream would be that back half would just reseed with everything. The birds wouldn't get all the seeds. Or they would till it up into that first few inches of what is now really great grass turned into topsoil. And then next year it would come up without me having to plant most of these things. I would just add in anything that is missing. But we'll see. We'll see if that works. And we'll see if anything grows in that spot. It's so shady that nothing might grow and we might completely readapt next year, but it's a good experiment. All right, and it's all planted out. Here's the divider. This in front of me is the chicken side with the coop and everything, and they still have about maybe a 50-60 foot run. And then from here on back is all planted up with grains and squash and root crops. And I'm hoping that the Three Sisters philosophy and stewardship gardening methodology carries through here. I'm hoping that just a random distribution will figure out which is supposed to grow where, and the ones that aren't supposed to grow where they aren't supposed to grow just won't grow, or they'll be eaten or what have you. I tilled up a little bit, or just kind of messed up the chicken side a little bit so that they had something to scratch and peck in, and they've already been at it. They really liked the damp grass, so to try to get them to stay on their side and not fly over and eat all the stuff I just put on the ground, I just sprayed their side and tossed down some for them. So hopefully they won't eat my experiment, and I'll give you an update and a later garden tour at the end of, well, not the end of the season, because there's a lot more between now and the end of the season, but hopefully by the end of the season I'll have some conclusive say on how this went. See you next time.